Picture a Victorian drawing room on Christmas Eve in 1867, where families gather not to sing carols or exchange gifts, but to extinguish the lamps and tell tales of the dead. The fire burns low, and shadows dance across the walls, while outside the winter wind howls through bare branches, and inside a voice begins to speak of ghosts who walk on holy nights. Children huddle closer to their parents, and even the adults feel their skin prickle, because Christmas in the Victorian age meant something far darker than we remember today. For our ancestors, the darkest night of the year was not a time for joy alone, but a season when the barrier between worlds grew thin and spirits crossed back into the realm of the living. Charles Dickens did not invent this tradition when he wrote A Christmas Carol. He merely captured something ancient and terrible that had existed for centuries before him. This is the story of how Christmas became horror season and why we forgot that the most wonderful time of the year was once the most frightening. If you're ready to look beyond the veil of forgotten myths and uncover the secrets the world chose to forget, subscribe to Inside Strange Times, so you won't miss new journeys into the realm of ancient mysteries. The connection between winter and the supernatural runs deeper than Victorian parlor games or literary fashion, because it stretches back to the earliest human memories of darkness and cold. Long before Christianity reached the shores of Britain, ancient peoples huddled in their settlements during the winter solstice and watched the sun die a little more each day. They did not know if it would return, and in that terrible uncertainty, they told stories of what walked in the darkness between the years. The old Celtic festival of Samhain marked the beginning of winter and the time when the veil between worlds grew thin enough for spirits to cross over. By December, the night stretched endless and black, and the living knew that something moved in those shadows, something that remembered being human but was not human anymore. When Rome brought Christianity to Britain, the old fears did not disappear but transformed into new shapes that the church could barely contain. The 12 days of Christmas, from December 25th to January 6th, became a liminal time when normal rules suspended and the dead were granted license to walk among the living. Medieval villagers knew that ghosts appeared most readily during these holy nights, and they developed elaborate rituals to protect themselves from supernatural visitors. Bells rang out to ward off evil spirits, and families left food offerings for the dead who might come calling. The Christmas season was sacred, but it was also dangerous because holiness and horror have always existed closer together than we like to admit. These ancient traditions carried forward through centuries of change, and by the time Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, Britain had developed a peculiar relationship with its ghosts. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the nation into a modern powerhouse of factories and railways and telegraphs, but it had also created a deep anxiety about what was being lost. Ancient forests fell to feed the furnaces, and rural communities emptied into sprawling cities where the old ways meant nothing. The Victorians responded to this upheaval by becoming obsessed with death and the afterlife in ways that seem almost pathological to modern eyes. Elaborate mourning rituals consumed years of people's lives, and spiritualism became a fashionable pursuit among both the working class and aristocracy. Death was everywhere in Victorian England because life was cheap and medicine was primitive, and everyone knew someone who had died young. Into this atmosphere of industrial progress and spiritual yearning came Charles Dickens with A Christmas Story that would change how English-speaking people understood the holiday forever. When A Christmas Carol appeared in December 1843, it sold 6,000 copies in the first week, and became an immediate cultural phenomenon that transcended literature to become something like a new gospel. Dickens did not invent the Christmas ghost story, but he legitimized it and made it respectable for middle-class families to gather around fires and scare themselves on holy nights. The tale of Ebenezer Scrooge, visited by four spirits on Christmas Eve, captured something essential about Victorian anxieties: the fear that industrial progress was destroying human compassion, and the hope that supernatural intervention might redeem even the coldest heart. But Dickens himself was drawing from a well of tradition that ran far deeper than his own imagination. He grew up hearing ghost stories told during winter gatherings, and he understood instinctively that Christmas and horror belonged together in the English imagination. In 1850, he launched a weekly magazine called Household Words and later All the Year Round, where he published dozens of supernatural tales specifically written for Christmas consumption. These were not gentle stories of redemption, like A Christmas Carol, but genuine horror tales featuring murderous ghosts and cursed objects, and people driven mad by supernatural encounters. Dickens wrote many of these stories himself, including The Signal Man, which remains one of the most terrifying ghost stories in the English language. The plot of The Signal Man is deceptively simple, but its execution is masterful in creating dread. A railway signalman is haunted by a spectral figure that appears before terrible accidents, warning of death but offering no way to prevent it. The ghost appears at the mouth of a tunnel, ringing a bell and covering its face, and each time it manifests, someone dies horribly on the tracks. The signalman becomes obsessed with understanding the warnings and preventing disaster, but he cannot because the ghost shows him the future without giving him the power to change it. In the end, the signalman himself is killed by a train whose driver was ringing his bell and covering his eyes from the sun, becoming the very death that the ghost had warned about. Dickens published this story in the 1866 Christmas edition of All the Year Round, and readers devoured it along with their plum pudding and wassail. What made Dickens's Christmas ghost stories so powerful was their ability to tap into very real Victorian anxieties about technology and progress. Railways were transforming Britain, but they were also killing people in spectacular accidents that the public followed with horrified fascination. Telegraph wires carried messages across impossible distances, but who could say what other signals they might pick up from the realm of the dead? Photography captured images of the living, but it also seemed to reveal the faces of ghosts hovering behind living subjects. The Victorians were building a modern world, but they suspected that modernity itself might be opening doors that should remain closed. Other writers quickly recognized the commercial potential of Christmas ghost stories and began producing them in industrial quantities. Publishers released special Christmas editions and gift books filled with supernatural tales designed to be read aloud during holiday gatherings. Authors like Elizabeth Gaskell and Wilkie Collins and Edward Bulwer-Lytton contributed stories that ranged from gentle Gothic romance to genuinely disturbing horror. These were not children's stories, despite being read at family gatherings. They featured graphic descriptions of corpses and violent deaths and people being driven insane by supernatural persecution. The Victorians did not shelter their children from darkness the way we do today, because death was too common and too visible to be hidden away. One of the most significant contributors to the Christmas ghost story tradition was Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, whose work influenced everyone who came after him. Lefanu was an Irish writer who published prolifically during the 1850s and 60s, producing some of the most psychologically complex horror fiction of the Victorian age. His story, Green Tea, published in 1869, concerns a clergyman who is haunted by a demonic monkey that only he can see. The monkey appears after he drinks too much green tea while researching pagan religions, and it follows him everywhere, whispering obscenities and urging him towards suicide. The story is terrifying, not because of graphic violence, but because of its psychological realism, the gradual erosion of the protagonist's sanity and his isolation as he realizes no one believes what is happening to him. Lefanu understood that the most frightening ghosts are not the ones that kill you quickly, but the ones that drive you mad slowly while the world watches and does nothing. His masterwork Carmilla, published in 1872, predated Bram Stoker's Dracula by 25 years and created the template for vampire fiction that we still follow today. The story concerns a young woman named Laura who lives in an isolated castle in Styria and is befriended by the mysterious Carmilla after a carriage accident. Carmilla is beautiful and charming and deeply strange. She sleeps through most of the day and speaks of loving Laura in ways that go beyond friendship into something more intense and physical. Laura begins to have terrible dreams of being bitten, and she weakens day by day while the local countryside is plagued by deaths from a mysterious illness. The revelation that Carmilla is a vampire who has been preying on Laura comes slowly and with mounting dread, and the final scene where they unearth Carmilla's corpse and find her fresh and undecayed, after centuries in the grave, remains genuinely disturbing. Lefanu wrote Carmilla for a Christmas edition, and Victorian families read this tale of lesbian vampirism while eating their Christmas dinner. The appetite for Christmas horror seemed insatiable during the Victorian era, and publishers competed to produce the most elaborate and frightening collections. The tradition reached such prominence that by the 1870s and 80s, A Christmas Without Ghost Stories seemed incomplete to the English reading public. Magazines ran special Christmas numbers that were essentially horror anthologies, and bookshops featured prominent displays of supernatural tales alongside religious texts and gift books. The stories ranged widely in quality and subject matter, but certain themes appeared repeatedly: haunted houses and vengeful ghosts and ancient curses, and people being punished from beyond the grave for sins they thought were forgotten. What united these stories was their fundamental seriousness about the supernatural. Victorian ghost story writers did not wink at their audience or treat the supernatural as mere entertainment. They wrote as if ghosts were real, and the afterlife was a place of genuine terror, where the damned suffered and the restless dead could find no peace. This seriousness gave the stories their power because readers could not dismiss them as simple fantasy. The writers and their audience shared a worldview in which the supernatural was not impossible, but merely unproven. Church attendance remained high throughout the Victorian period, and most people believed in souls in heaven and hell, even if they questioned the specifics. Ghost stories operated in the uncertain space between faith and doubt. They assumed that something existed after death, but left the nature of that something terrifyingly vague. The physical act of telling and reading these stories became a ritual that families observed with almost religious devotion. After Christmas dinner was cleared away and the servants had retired, the family would gather in the drawing room or library. Someone would dim the lamps until the room existed in that peculiar half-light where shadows could be anything. The fire would be the primary source of illumination, and its flickering would make faces look strange and unfamiliar. Then, someone, usually the father or an uncle or a particularly dramatic aunt, would begin to read from a book of ghost stories. The tradition demanded that the reader perform the story with appropriate drama, changing voices for different characters, and pausing for effect, and making the audience wait for the horrifying revelation. Children would be allowed to stay up for this, despite the frightening content, because the Victorians believed that learning to manage fear was an important part of growing up. A child who could listen to a ghost story without crying or running away was demonstrating maturity and self-control. Of course, many children did cry and have nightmares and refused to sleep alone for weeks afterward. But this was considered a reasonable price for the entertainment and tradition. The very fact that the stories were told at Christmas gave them additional weight because the holy season was supposed to be a time of family togetherness and joy. Introducing horror into that context created a delicious transgression that made the fear more intense. The tradition also served a social function beyond mere entertainment, because ghost stories allowed Victorians to discuss topics that were otherwise forbidden in polite society. Stories about ghosts seeking revenge for murder allowed discussion of violence and justice. Tales of women returning from the grave to protect their children touched on fears about maternal mortality, which claimed thousands of women every year. Stories about people being punished for sexual transgression allowed oblique discussion of adultery and desire in ways that would have been scandalous in any other context. The supernatural became a safe space to explore dangerous topics because everyone understood that these were just stories, even if they also believed that the stories might contain some deeper truth about the universe. By the 1880s, the Christmas ghost story tradition had become so established that it began to develop its own conventions and rules. Readers expected certain elements to appear: isolated settings and unreliable narrators, and revelations that came too late to save the protagonist. They wanted stories that built slowly toward moments of genuine terror rather than relying on cheap shocks. The best writers understood that the most frightening horror comes from suggestion rather than explicit description, from what is glimpsed at the edge of vision rather than shown clearly. This restraint made the stories more effective because it allowed readers' imaginations to create horrors more personal and disturbing than any author could describe. The physical books themselves became more elaborate as publishers recognized the commercial potential of the Christmas ghost story market. Special gift editions appeared with leather bindings and gilt edges and elaborate illustrations. Some volumes included multiple stories from different authors, while others featured a single novella-length tale. The books were designed to be beautiful objects that could be displayed prominently and given as prestigious gifts. Owning a collection of Christmas ghost stories became a marker of cultural sophistication and good taste. Middle-class families who aspired to gentility made sure to have appropriate volumes on hand when guests arrived during the Christmas season. The publishing success of Christmas ghost stories created a market that attracted writers of varying talent and ambition, but few understood the form as deeply as Montague Rhodes James. James was a medieval scholar at Cambridge University who had spent his life studying ancient manuscripts and church history, and he brought that scholarly precision to the ghost story in ways that revolutionized the genre. His stories were not gothic melodramas but quiet tales of antiquarian researchers who stumble onto supernatural horrors while examining old documents or excavating ancient sites. James understood that the most effective horror comes from the intrusion of the impossible into the mundane, and that academics making careful notes in dusty libraries are somehow more vulnerable than melodramatic heroes facing obvious danger. Beginning in 1895, James established a Christmas Eve tradition that would continue for decades and become legendary among his colleagues and students. Each year, on December 24th, he would invite a select group to his rooms at King's College, Cambridge, where they would gather around the fire after dinner. James would turn down the lamps until the room existed in flickering shadows, and then he would read aloud a new ghost story that he had written specifically for that evening. The tradition was intimate and theatrical. James was a gifted performer who understood how to use his voice and timing to maximize the terror of his tales. He would pause at crucial moments and let the silence stretch until his listeners were nearly unbearable with tension, and then he would deliver the horrifying revelation in a calm, almost casual tone that made it even more disturbing. The stories James read on those Christmas Eves were unlike anything that had come before because they combined scholarly authenticity with genuine supernatural horror. His protagonists were not innocent victims, but curious researchers who actively sought out forbidden knowledge and paid terrible prices for their curiosity. In Canon Alberic's scrapbook, published in 1895, a scholar examining medieval manuscripts in a French cathedral encounters a demon that has been bound to a particular book for centuries. The description of the demon is brief but unforgettable. It has a face covered in hair and eyes that burn with malevolent intelligence and hands that are too long and end in claws. The scholar escapes, but the demon follows him, and the story ends with the implication that some knowledge cannot be unlearned and some horrors cannot be outrun. James's masterpiece, "Oh, Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad," first read at Christmas 1904, remains one of the most terrifying ghost stories ever written. The protagonist is a Cambridge professor named Parkins, who travels to the coast for a golfing holiday and discovers an ancient whistle buried in the ruins of a Templar church. Being a rationalist and skeptic, Parkins blows the whistle despite the Latin inscription warning against it, and that night something begins to pursue him. James builds the terror slowly through a series of increasingly disturbing encounters. Strange figures on the beach that move in impossible ways and bed sheets that animate themselves, and a presence in Parkins's room that he cannot see but can hear breathing. The climax comes when Parkins sees a figure made of crumpled linen rushing toward him across the beach and realizes that his rational worldview cannot protect him from what he has summoned. The story works because James never fully explains what the whistle summoned or why it wants Parkins. The horror remains mysterious and therefore inexhaustible. What made James's stories particularly effective was his use of realistic detail and scholarly apparatus to create authenticity. He included footnotes and references to actual historical documents and described the physical appearance of manuscripts with the precision of someone who had examined thousands of them. This grounding in reality made the supernatural elements more disturbing because they erupted from a world that felt completely believable. James also understood that the most frightening ghosts are not transparent spirits, but physical presences that can touch and grab and suffocate. His ghosts have weight and texture. They are covered in hair, or wrapped in wet sheets, or made of animate dust, and they leave physical traces that prove their existence. The Christmas Eve readings at King's College became so popular that James eventually collected his stories into books that were published specifically as Christmas volumes. Ghost Stories of an Antiquary appeared in 1904 and became an immediate success among readers who were hungry for sophisticated horror. James published 3 more collections over the following decades, and each one was timed to appear in bookshops just before Christmas. His work influenced an entire generation of writers who understood that ghost stories could be both literary and terrifying, that horror did not require melodrama or gothic excess, but could be created through careful prose and psychological insight. But even as James was perfecting the Christmas ghost story in the early 20th century, the tradition itself was beginning to fracture and fade. The First World War destroyed much of the Victorian world and the certainties that had supported it. After 4 years of mechanized slaughter on an industrial scale, ghost stories about moldy manuscripts and ancient curses seemed almost quaint. Real horror had moved from the realm of supernatural fiction into newspaper headlines and government casualty reports. Young men who had seen their friends torn apart by machine gun fire and poison gas did not need ghost stories to understand that the universe was cruel and indifferent. The war also disrupted the social rituals that had sustained the Christmas ghost story tradition. Families that had gathered for generations to read horror tales on Christmas Eve found their gatherings diminished by death and absence. The custom of sitting in dim firelight and frightening oneself seemed frivolous when so many were mourning real losses. Some families abandoned the tradition entirely, while others maintained it as a way of preserving connection to a world that had been destroyed. But the tradition had lost its innocence. It was no longer possible to experience the delicious safe fear of a ghost story when actual horror was so recent and so real. The rise of cinema in the 1920s and 30s also changed how people consumed horror. Moving pictures could show monsters and violence in ways that were impossible in prose, and the communal experience of watching a film in a darkened theater replaced the intimate family gathering around the fire. Horror films were released throughout the year rather than being concentrated at Christmas, and they were designed to appeal to young audiences seeking thrills rather than families seeking traditional entertainment. The commercial logic of Hollywood had no interest in connecting horror to specific holidays or maintaining literary traditions. Horror became a genre rather than a seasonal ritual, something to be consumed year-round rather than experienced at specific sacred times. Christmas itself was also changing in ways that left less room for darkness and fear. The Victorian Christmas had been a complex holiday that acknowledged death alongside life and darkness alongside light. But the 20th century Christmas became increasingly commercialized and sanitized. Advertisers and retailers wanted Christmas to be about consumption and family togetherness and domestic joy, not about ghosts and death and supernatural terror. The image of Santa Claus replaced more ambiguous figures like Father Christmas, and the emphasis shifted entirely to children's happiness and gift-giving. Christmas became a holiday from which anything dark or challenging was systematically excluded. By the 1950s, the Christmas ghost story tradition had largely disappeared from English-speaking culture. M.R. James died in 1936, and no one really replaced him as the master of the form. Publishers stopped releasing special Christmas volumes of ghost stories, and families stopped gathering to read them aloud. The stories themselves remained in print and continued to influence horror writers, but they were no longer connected to Christmas in the public imagination. Horror had been separated from the holiday season and relocated to October and Halloween, where it seemed more appropriate to modern sensibilities. Some traces of the tradition persisted in British culture longer than in America. The BBC began producing Christmas ghost story adaptations for television in the 1970s, with James's tales being particular favorites. These broadcasts attracted dedicated audiences who remembered when Christmas meant more than tinsel and television specials, but they were seen as quaint throwbacks rather than living traditions. Each year, fewer people watched, and fewer still understood why ghost stories and Christmas had ever been connected in the first place. The loss of the Christmas ghost story tradition represents something larger than just a change in entertainment preferences. It reflects a fundamental shift in how English-speaking cultures understand darkness and fear and their relationship to sacred time. The Victorians accepted that winter was dark and death was everywhere, and that acknowledging these truths did not diminish joy, but made it more precious. They understood that Christmas existed in tension between light and dark, that the birth of the Christ child was meaningful precisely because it occurred at the darkest time of year when hope seemed most impossible. Ghost stories at Christmas were not a contradiction, but a recognition that life contains multitudes, that we can celebrate birth and remember death in the same breath. Modern Christmas has lost this complexity and become a holiday of enforced cheerfulness where darkness is not acknowledged but suppressed. We tell ourselves that Christmas is for children and therefore must contain only light and magic and wonder. But children are not as fragile as we pretend, and they understand more about darkness than we admit. Victorian children listened to terrifying ghost stories on Christmas Eve and grew up to be functional adults, perhaps because they learned early that fear could be faced and survived and even enjoyed in the right context. By sanitizing Christmas, we have made it less honest and possibly less meaningful, because a holiday that cannot acknowledge darkness has no depth and no staying power. The ancient impulse that created the Christmas ghost story tradition has not disappeared, but merely been displaced. We still tell horror stories and we still seek out fear as entertainment, but we have separated these things from their sacred context and made them purely secular. Halloween has become the designated horror holiday in American culture, but it lacks the weight and tradition that Christmas carried. Halloween is carnivalesque and playful, a night for costumes and candy when fear is domesticated into fun. It does not have the gravity of Christmas, the sense that something important is happening that connects us to ancient fears and eternal questions. What we have lost is the understanding that horror serves a purpose beyond entertainment, that frightening ourselves in controlled circumstances helps us cope with real fears that cannot be controlled. The Victorians faced death constantly. Infant mortality was staggering, and disease claimed people in their prime without warning. Ghost stories allowed them to confront these fears in narrative form, to experience dread and terror, and survive it and return to the warmth and safety of family and firelight. The stories reminded them that death was not the end, but a transformation into something mysterious and possibly terrible, and that reminder made them value life more fiercely. Perhaps we need to recover something of that Victorian wisdom in our own time. We live in an age of different anxieties, climate catastrophe and political instability, and the creeping sense that we are losing control of the technologies we have created. We need ways to process these fears that are more substantial than mindless consumption or pharmaceutical numbing. The Christmas ghost story tradition offered our ancestors a way to face darkness communally, to gather with loved ones, and acknowledge that terrible things exist, but that we do not face them alone. There is something profound in the act of frightening ourselves on purpose while surrounded by people we trust, something that speaks to deep human needs for both individual courage and collective resilience. The ghosts that haunted Victorian Christmas fires have not gone away. They have only changed their forms. They manifest now in anxiety disorders and depression epidemics and the low-grade terror of watching the news. But we face them alone in our separate homes, staring at separate screens, without the ritual and community that made fear bearable and even meaningful. The Victorian Christmas ghost story tradition was not perfect. It could be melodramatic and sometimes cruel, but it understood something essential about human nature that we have forgotten. It knew that darkness and light must coexist, that joy is deepened by the acknowledgement of sorrow, and that the most wonderful time of the year is also the most frightening, because it forces us to confront what matters most. On a winter night in 1895, Montague Rhodes, James sat by a fire in Cambridge and read a story about a demon bound to a medieval manuscript. His listeners leaned forward in the flickering shadows and felt their skin prickle with delicious fear, knowing that when the story ended, they would return to warmth and laughter and the comfort of fellowship. That moment contained something we have lost, a way of being human that acknowledged both terror and joy without letting either consume the other. Perhaps someday we will rediscover that on the longest nights of winter, when the darkness presses close and the wind howls outside, the best thing we can do is gather close to the fire and tell each other the truth about what frightens us. Because the ghosts are real, they always have been, and the only question is whether we face them together or alone.